I think there is a recognition now, first, that it is not our narrative only. It's not the narrative of people in suits who get to speak in the halls of power in UNGA. There are counter-narratives that have to be heard. And hopefully we will be one of those platforms that allow them to be heard.
Welcome to Rethinking Humanitarianism, a show that explores the future of aid in a world of rising crisis. I'm Levi Sharpe, the producer of this show. So today we're doing something a little bit different. I'm here on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York, along with the show's regular host, Tammam Aloudat, CEO of the New Humanitarian. We're going to talk about the mood here, what people are talking about, and what it all says about where humanitarian action is heading. This is the 80th UNGA, and one that should be consequential, given all that's happening in the world. The genocide in Gaza, emergencies elsewhere, the rise of illiberalism, aid cuts, and the crisis of trust in the UN system. But does the rhetoric here match the urgency we see across the globe? If you have any questions or comments, stick around for the credits to learn about how to reach us here at Rethinking Humanitarianism. Tammam, thank you for joining us.
It's good to be here, Levi. And we're recording in person for the first time.
I know. We just met for the first time in person.
We just met for the first time in person, yes.
How does it feel being on that side of the microphone?
It's what I was used to. It's the hosting that I'm still getting used to now.
Well, I'll try not to let the power to get to my head being on this side of the mic. So, this UNGA, obviously, it's the UN's 80th birthday.
Mm-hmm.
Highly anticipated, widely viewed as a very consequential UNGA, given our current times. We seem to be at many different kinds of inflection points. You just got done covering the global Samoan flotilla. Talk about that, the dichotomy between these two types of humanitarianisms, in a way.
So I got invited by participants and organizers in the global Samoan flotilla to join what is called the legal support boat. This is one of two boats who include the one I was on, named after Shireen Abu Akleh, who's the Palestinian journalist who was killed by the Israelis in Jenin refugee camp in 2022, included international lawyers, a member of the European Parliament from Ireland, doctors and students and organizers. And I went first to Barcelona for the launch of the flotilla on the 30th of August, and then joined the boat in Catania in Sicily and stayed with them until Tunis. I couldn't stay longer because I had to come to the UN General Assembly. But it is a visibly different world we're talking about here. There are plenty of humanitarians who will tell you that, humanitarianism and activism are entirely different and separate things. I think the flotilla prevents that rhetoric from taking ground because it is a humanitarian act. It aims at delivering aid that it carries with it, but also at breaking the siege that has been going for months now, with nearly complete blockade of humanitarian aid. So there is a humanitarian corridor that can be established. In a way, if the organizers of the flotilla were acknowledged humanitarian organizations, it wouldn't have ruffled many feathers. But because their whole idea is governments fail, we sail. And that means that there is an implicit acknowledgement of the failure of the system. On the other hand, the sort of schizophrenic bit is going away from that, from being on the boat, jumping on a few flights, and then ending up in New York, where people are not even the sort of middle ground humanitarians. This is the high level, the people who feel like they were born in suits and who speak about things as if they own the world. And those are two different universes. And I would normally say both of them are important, but they are, in this occasion, Well, I'm talking about Gaza particularly here. I think the consequences of that dichotomy will carry on to affect other emergencies. They feel less and less compatible, and I think humanitarianism will have to haggle with its ambivalent position, where it believes both in the system and in activism and in delivering aid at any cost and with the sovereignty of states and all of that together. So to me, it feels like seeing those in quick sequence shakes what I still was trying to hold together, intellectually in my head.
It's interesting because I do feel like the common person would think humanitarianism is activism. I think the general population might combine those two things as one. What would you say humanitarianism is, if not activism?
I think humanitarianism is not one thing. There are humanitarianisms. And the assumption that when we say humanitarianism is like when we say now in our world philosophy and mean exclusively Western philosophy. When we say civilization, we mean, colonial Western white civilization. Humanitarianisms exist just like cultures exist and just like philosophies exist. And in a sense, even Western humanitarianism, which we see here in UNGA and which I have worked in most of my life, comes from an activist ground. People don't join a humanitarian organization in principle because they want to be in the middle of the road and speak diplomatically and be polite. They join it because they want to change things that they see as unjust.
Right.
But even institutionally, let's go back a little bit. In 1970, MSF was created by people who felt that the ICRC in Biafra wasn't being outspoken enough. That was an activist position, and it was dismissed at the time as such. But over the past couple of decades, there has been a movement towards professionalization in humanitarianism. And I think here professionalization is multiple things as well. It is good. If you're doing medicine, you need to do professional medicine. You don't, carry people's lives lightly. But the idea that professionalism includes managerialism and hierarchies and control mechanisms and so on.
And bureaucracies on bureaucracies on bureaucracies.
Absolutely. Yeah. It creates the idea that it is like scientific and can be managed. Any humanitarian operation is an example of complexity. It's not complicated, it's complex. And here it's important to distinguish in complexity and chaos theory. They say like a watch is complicated. It's a lot of mechanisms. But if you break a gear, you can replace it and the watch goes back to working. Complex systems are different. It's like the weather. It's like human society. There are multiple factors and multiple interdependencies. This is why weathermen can't predict the weather. It's too complex to be predicted always accurately. So humanitarianism functions in a complex system and increases its complexity. And the idea that we can control this by models and management and so on is delusional. But for that model to work, you need hierarchy and you need the people who look the role. And it depends where you are. If you are in the field, as still called, you look a certain way. If you are an UNGA, you need to have a three-piece suit and know how to talk your way through UNGA. But most humanitarian aid started as political activism, historically. Save the Children started by two sisters in the early century, just after World War II, and they were different. One of them was a socialist and the other was conservative, but they were political activists in a way. The same goes for MSF, the same goes for many of those. And as sure as I can be, the same goes for many of the local organizations that have been functioning closest to the people affected. So the dismissal of activism as a mechanism of humanitarianism is inaccurate and potentially facetious. What I see it more is there is a continuum of humanitarianisms that addresses multiple layers of this complex system. And rather than one dismissing the other, rather than us sort of kicking, trench mates, it is actually collaboration on equal footing and with respect that makes a difference. So this dismissal of, the flotilla is irrelevant is not true. And to an extent, similarly, to dismiss UNGA as irrelevant is not true.
It almost seems just like an imbalance we've created over time.
It is an imbalance. And here, we're talking today about a humanitarian reset. And the humanitarian reset is supposed to solve the problems of the past, make it leaner, make it more efficient, make it more based on decisions that are made closest to the field, to the people affected. I mean, this is not a new conversation. It happened 10 years ago with the Grand Bargain. It happened before that as well. The imbalance of it is that people who talk about the reform are people in power. And in my experience, or at least historically, people in power rarely give up power because they feel unsure about it. So when you talk about the imbalance, who gets to be here and speak? Increasingly, to be fair, there are people who function in the system who come from the same communities that are affected. I mean, I worked in humanitarianism, and I come from Syria, a country that suffered war for 15 years and was a subject and an object of humanitarianism at the same time. But that's one thing. The other is people from local organizations are largely represented. But we also need to acknowledge who gets to be invited. I mean, you need to speak good English, you need to have had an education, you need to have
a three-piece suit.
And enough exposure to how things are done normally and enough acceptance of the system as is to be represented. So there is also a matter of handing off power from people who are internationally powerful to people who are nationally powerful. It doesn't mean automatically that people who are affected by emergencies are better off in the end of the day.
Let's talk a little bit about the people in suits. Obviously, this is high-level week, a lot of big speeches. Give me your impressions of Trump's speech, and specifically, what's the wider picture here of what this speech means for the world?
I mean, the first order thing is messiness. Even the almost comical messiness of, the escalator is broken.
As far as I'm concerned, frankly, looking at the building and getting stuck on the escalator, they still haven't finished the job.
And the teleprompter.
And I don't mind making this speech without a teleprompter, because the teleprompter is not working.
Funny enough, you'll read in the news now that the escalator was broken by his cameraman and the teleprompter wasn't the UN's, it was actually the White House's. They insist.
The call was coming from inside the house.
But it doesn't matter. The fact that the president of the biggest country in the world is ranting about the escalator and about the teleprompter and about not having been given the contract to renovate the UN 20 years ago or something.
I bid on the renovation and rebuilding of this very United Nations complex. I remember it so well. I said at the time that I would do it for $500 million, rebuilding everything. It would be beautiful. I used to talk about, I'm going to give you marble floors. They're going to give you terrazzo.
A high-level official in the UN, when I asked him what he thought about it, and I'm not going to mention the name, but quite senior, said this is normalizing buffoonery, distracting people from actually what's happening. This is the first layer. Take it aside. You wouldn't expect any better from Trump anyway, given that we've been made to watch enough of his speeches. But there is a layer that is different here, and I think it's important. He's talked about his normal grudges. He barely mentioned the genocide in Gaza. He said the conflict has to stop immediately, but not how or why or towards what end. And then he went into massive rants about immigration.
Not only is the UN not solving the problems it should, too often, it's actually creating new problems for us to solve. The best example is the number one political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. It's uncontrolled. Your countries are being ruined.
About green policies, about climate policies.
The primary effect of these brutal green energy policies has not been to help the environment, but to redistribute manufacturing and industrial activity from developed countries that follow the insane rules that are put down to polluting countries that break the rules and are making a fortune.
And about a couple of other things. What gives me a pause is previously He was saying, our country is being destroyed by immigrants, and we need to do this. Or climate policies are destroying our economy. He was talking about the US. This speech was different. He wasn't talking about the US. It was a fait accompli. It was finished, done. He said, we solved the problem. Now it's you who will solve it. And he leaned hard on Europe.
Right. He said they're being ruined. The other countries going to hell.
I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell.
And I mean, he said it about everybody, but obviously it was directed at Europe. He talked about the UK particularly. He said stuff like the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is bringing Sharia law.
I look at London where you have a terrible mayor, terrible mayor. And it's been so changed. Now they want to go to Sharia law.
I have friends who live there, and honestly, it's weird that they never brought it up to me.
I know,
apparently.
I know. But be careful. I mean, you have a beard, you'll get by. But the point was, he doesn't feel the need to justify himself anymore. What he's doing is giving license to reactionary politicians in Europe to ride on his words and start attacking those policies of immigration, of asylum protection, of climate protection. They can say, look, these are our partners, they're pushing us in this direction and we should do it. And so there's a point where it feels to me that Trump feels that he's achieved the bigger mission he has at home in terms of creating a policy environment where those extreme policies get implemented easily. And he's trying to export it now.
I mean, much like I'm sure Trump's stance on, say, LGBTQI plus policies and things emboldens the rest of the world to backslide. And it's sort of in this speech, he's bringing this permission of anti-immigration, anti-environmentalism to the rest of the countries.
And from a humanitarian perspective, this is also unnerving because there's the duality of, first, the US and those countries that will start sliding back are the main donors of humanitarianism in its form that we know now. And because those policies will cause more humanitarian crises. I mean, it's not like we were winning the battle on climate crisis. It was already in a very difficult situation. But the climate causes acute humanitarian crisis, whether those are conflicts, failures of crops, population movement. And there are anticipations of, now we have about 110 million displaced people globally. There is an anticipation of 500 million. And there's no way, even in the best of days, that the humanitarian system will be able to cope with such numbers.
Were there any speeches that actually resonated with you? Maybe some kind of palate cleanser?
Some were, yes. President Lula of Brazil gave a speech, and it was comprehensive. He called for continuation of multilateralism, of protection of people, of not arbitrarily intervening in other people's affairs, and also of Bolsonaro and his attempted coup in Brazil. And he was directing some of it at the US because the US have been supporting Bolsonaro and Trump administration and have been challenging Lula's position quite aggressively. Funny enough, when you hear Trump's speech, he spends a bit time talking about how he bumped into Lula. And
Yeah, apparently they became like best friends in like 39 seconds or something.
Yes, for some time he has chemistry and he says, I work with people I like, you know that, I don't work with people, which is funny. But anyhow, I think part of me was hoping for a more energetic, more charismatic speech that sort of inspires rather than only convinces. And this is the point that I'm keep looking for and I don't really find is if we're looking at the deterioration towards far-right politics across the world, in the US and in Europe primarily, I mean, that changes the political landscape. I'm not talking about the alternative being far left. I'm talking about an anti-reactionary position that needs inspiration. I mean, it's not enough to be logically right. It's not enough to be able to defend your, and especially in a time, we work in journalism and we know to construct a valid argument takes a lot of work.
Well, you can't just have logos, you need the pathos too, right?
Exactly. And right now is pathos, no logos, and no ethos as well. And the other side, whether that is the left or progressivism or whatever, is possibly ethos. I'm not sure if they have as much as they think they do, and potentially a lot of logos, but no pathos. There's no inspiring conversation. It used to be that you talk about helping people, about solidarity, that inspire people into action. And some of it does. And here we go back to the flotilla. In Italy, there has been a strike, massive strike for 24 hours. The trade unions said, we lose contact with the flotilla, we close everything. But that is seen as radical politics. We have squeezed ourselves in a place where we have to be logical and level-headed and be unmoved by all this like worldly things. It doesn't work this way. We have to have a reason to act, and reason to act for and reason to act against whatever it is. And particularly in an age where creating a lie takes a second and debunking it takes a lot of time.
You can't build incentives with just pure logical arguments.
No, you can't. So talking about pathos, the Colombian president's speech, where he actually talked quite strongly about what's happening in Gaza and asked for activation of the United for Peace resolution that allows the General Assembly to sidestep the veto power of the Security Council and create a protection force. And he asked particularly for a protection force in Gaza, armed international force that protects Palestinians and protects aid. And we've talked about that in an event a couple of weeks ago where we discussed what could humanitarians do to end the genocide, and potentially was asking for an intervention was one of those. Colombia has asked for it, and it's unclear to me. I'm trying to find out whether there will be a vote on a United for Peace resolution. This will need 2/3 vote, and I'm hearing that there is pushback. People are nervous because, it's one thing to vote it, then how do you create a multinational force without the US, Russia, or China that will actually go there and put itself in the face of the Israeli military with its might, but also potentially with the US military? It's a tempting idea until you think, how do you do it? But at the same time, there are progresses from very different sides, talking about the flotilla and about protection. The Italian government are sending a frigate, I believe, to protect their citizens on the flotilla, grudgingly and not from a compassionate point of view, but the idiots went there were going to have to extract them. But the Spanish government also announced that they are sending a warship. They're not calling it a warship, but it's a military ship that is equipped with all the necessary equipment to accompany the flotilla. They're not saying defend. They're not saying, at least not in the. But
just hang out.
Hang out, yes.
Just hang out.
But it is a strong message. It is, and their immediate response from Israelis is that Spain has announced declared war. The Twitter sphere. Spain has announced war and will break the integrity of the Israeli territorial waters. But funny enough, they've never intercepted the previous flotillas after they went into Israeli waters. They always intercepted them in international waters. So there's a lot of talk, but there are things that are changing. And I think this is not straightforward, but there is a rhetorical change that was recognized. And here we go. If we talk about Palestine and Gaza and Israel for a second, there has been a recognition of Palestine as a state by multiple countries. And here it is also two different things. Some people are finding this a massive step in the right direction. And this is annoying because until now there were more than 140 countries that have recognized Palestine, but it only matters when Europeans recognize. So this is one thing. But it also is a problematic one because, okay, we recognize you, we've done what we need to do, but we're not going to stop the genocide. And we're not going to put any extra pressure on Israel. So it's a feels, from both sides apparently, it feels like a rhetorical.
Feels performative.
And there's a lot of it that is performative. I mean, it's one thing to recognize, and that should have happened a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
The state of Palestine, I believe, was announced in 1988. But to do it in the middle of the genocide without having the implication of actually stopping the genocide is a problematic position. And until now, I don't know of anything that meaningfully will do that. This is where I say UNGA underwhelms. I mean, the biggest governance political body in the world, this core of multilateralism, is not going to do anything. We are in a stalemate. And we will have, last day of the high-level week, Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, who is under an arrest warrant by the ICC, is going to fly yet again to the US. He will stand on that podium and give a speech. I mean, it's one thing for the US to give someone who is allegedly a war criminal and allegedly potentially committing genocide a visa. That's their business. They're not signatories to the ICC Rome Statute anyway. But for the UN to allow him to stand there and give a speech, of course, there'll be many who will leave the room in protest of his presence. But we are in a time where President Abbas, who has a million problems, and probably not the best thing that has happened to Palestinians in a long time, gets to speak only through video because he wasn't given a visa to the US, and someone who should be arrested because he's under an arrest warrant of the ICC gets to travel and give a speech in the headquarters of the United Nations. This tells you everything you need to know about how shocking it is.
Well, it's like what you're saying. Who gets to be invited?
Who gets to be invited? I mean, we sit now and we think about, in 1936, there was a Olympics in Germany and everybody went there. And there was all the Nazi paraphernalia and the militarization. And it's not like people thought the Nazis were great. Everybody was, okay, it's an Olympics. We shouldn't think about politics. But the Nazis thought about politics. They created a glorifying event that gave them legitimacy and everybody played their role. Now you sit and think, how on earth did people think it was a good idea? We will have the same thing. In enough time, hopefully not in 80 years, we'll have the same thing. Oh God, the guy who was doing genocide was invited and gave a speech twice because he did it last year as well.
Mm-hmm.
There was also the speech by the Syrian president. I mean, in a different General Assembly where, there aren't all the other things, that would have been much more high profile. But it was, in a way, the Syrian president. I mean, it defeats me. He is extremely articulate, very well positioned. This is a guy who has been in prison in Iraq in the 2010s for 5 years in British and American prisons, was a jihadi fighter who has been stuck in Idlib, a small town in northwest Syria, for the past 12 or 13 years, and who has become president last January. He gave a speech. Effectively, the ask he has is drop the sanctions. And the sanctions were put on Syria by the US, by Western countries, against the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. And in a way, it comes to logic that that regime has gone, and the sanctions are unnecessary, at least for the same reason. The US has lifted some of the sanctions. The Europeans are going in that direction. But also, there is side stuff that I'm sure he's trying to resolve from, not on the speech, but in being here. Some of them is the fears about sectarian violence that has happened with the Alawi and Druze minorities in Syria, and the possibility of that spreading. And part of it is about Israel having occupied more beyond the Golan Heights in Syria and are sitting there. And part of it is about Syria now a country without an army, because Israel bombed the whole of the Syrian army after it's funny, they didn't do it when Assad was there, but they did it after he fell. I think, again, from a humanitarian perspective, there are a couple of things. A lot of humanitarian aid organizations have started going back to Syria who didn't have access before. From people I know on the ground, I think my understanding is that the registration is not very difficult, that there is an ability to access, to have coordination, to be able to have safe passage and so on, which is quite significant because it's absolutely important for aid to come in. And here, I also want to make another distinction. This is a country of about 20 million people, and aid organizations aren't going to solve the problems of post 15 years. There isn't enough aid money to do that, or aid expertise. So it is also important to recognize that there are millions of people who are potentially going to be returnees in Syria, and a lot of them started coming back, and that the diaspora money is what actually will rebuild the economy. It's not the aid money.
Mm-hmm.
So when they talk about, and I want to say that, I mean, selfishly, from my perspective, one of the biggest difficulties of being a Syrian in diaspora was sending money home to, whatever you needed to send money to. Now the banking system sanctions have been lifted. Apparently, I haven't tried it yet, but apparently you can send money freely to banks there without being blocked and your bank account, problematically stopped, or you can't physically send money. I think that is a massive difference. And when we talk about aid, we think about delivering foods and blankets and stuff. It is important to allow normalization of life by the delivery of money. People need to have money to spend. So there is an economy that functions, but there isn't enough money in the country. And I think that needs to be factored in the conversation. And I know that well because it's my country and I have family there, but it probably applies similarly. And we know it also from Somalia, where the Hawala system from the US, for example, you give money to someone here and they give money to your family there and you pay a commission. So those things will need to be particularly addressed in the context of rehabilitation and aid and return of refugees, as well as, rebuilding health system, delivering food, delivering, services to people who are still displaced. And it's hopefully going to happen. But then my fear with Syria is that, thank God things didn't go to hell, but there's no guarantee that, things can't break. It's fragile. After 15 years of war and 50 years of dictatorship, things are fragile. And also, hopefully, that peace holds on so people can return and start rebuilding their lives.
Final question. What are we trying to do at the New Humanitarian to respond to the politics and narratives that are being played here at UNGA?
I think, look, our reporting in essence is a response to this. Mm-hmm. What we are trying to do, what we have always been trying to do and are doubling down on, is that we cover by vigorous and fact-based journalism what is happening in humanitarian contexts. We cover the facts, we cover the humanitarian politics as well, and we do investigations. Just in the past couple of weeks, we've had an investigation, the database on the killing of aid seekers in Gaza, which brings a long investigation to conclusion and becomes part of the evidence about what's happening there. We cover the policies of organizations, we cover the stories of what is happening to people, and we try to elevate people's voices. Now, we've just finished an event. The event had really amazing set of humanitarians who talked about particularly what localization is, where it is, what is humanitarianism at the local level. We did this with Refugees International. This is the second time, I believe, that we've had a side event to the UNGA in New York. And this time we brought dispatches from people about education, about protection, and about the shape of the humanitarian sector from people who are from the affected communities. We've brought people who talked about mutual aid. And there was someone from the emergency response rooms in Sudan, Haneen, who was talking about their experience there. We had someone from ODI, the Overseas Development Institute here in New York, who talked to us about the policy angle, Elizabeth. And then we had Marcia, who was in USAID before, deputy director, and she's talked about what's happening in New York and in the politics here. And we had Lorraine from Philippines, who talked about disaster preparedness and risk reduction. And the panel was facilitated really well by Dr. Horia Tafish from Refugees International. And then we had Alice Armani-Secchi, who's the director of pooled funding in OCHA, who gave closing remarks. I think there is a recognition now First, that it is not our narrative only. It's not the narrative of people in suits who get to speak in the halls of power in UNGA. There are counter narratives that have to be heard. And hopefully we will be one of those platforms that allow them to be heard in an unbiased and a dignified manner. The other thing is that it's not only heard, it's acted upon. And we were talking about shifting power. And I mean, our audience can listen to our Shifting Power podcast, which exactly talks about that. But it's also worth noting that people with power don't give up power nicely. There has to be a form of resistance. And that resistance is enabled by those humanitarians on the ground and people affected being heard, being empowered, taking what is theirs, which is their agency, their ability to be treated in a dignified manner. And we do want to be in service of that cause. Now, whether you call that political or humanitarian, I don't think that is what matters. What matters is in moving from politics of charity, where people affected by crises are objects acted upon by donors and humanitarians, into a politics of solidarity, where they are the subjects that act upon their lives, there is a long way. And that long way doesn't only happen in the UN building here, or in that of Geneva, or in the Western capitals. It happens everywhere. And we have a lot of choices to do, both in general and every day, on where do we stand in that conversation. I have learned that I stand, and I stood proudly with that flotilla because that action makes a difference. And I came here, and there are people I have enormous respect for here, and I stand beside them. But we all have to make those choices. It's not about any individual. It is the collectivity of exchanging, learning from each other, giving the dues to people we serve, and sticking to what we believe is right in a time of great difficulty, both financial and political, is going to be a test to humanitarianism, and is probably part of the birth pains of the new humanitarianism.
And that event that we just had is titled Remaking Humanitarianism, Dispatches from the Future during the 80th UN General Assembly. We'll be putting that in this podcast feed. And Tammam, thank you for giving your impressions of UNGA this year and letting me sit in your chair for a little bit.
It's fun to be on this side. I mean, the struggle I have in hosting is that I don't get to babble my opinions. And thank you. Thank you for letting me do that. Thank you for listening to Rethinking Humanitarianism. Our show is produced, edited, and mixed by Levi Sharpe. Editorial oversight provided by Erwin Loy, Eric Reddy, and Freddie Buswell. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@thenewhumanitarian.org. Please rate and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider becoming a member of The New Humanitarian to help us continue reporting from the heart of crises. Go to www.thenewhumanitarian.org to find out more.